In IB Bio, Evolution, Natural Selection, Additional Higher Level, Part 2, Topic 10.3, we will look again at speciation, but we'll take a new approach that includes new language. No worries, the new language is not difficult. As well, we'll examine rates of evolution. The essential idea is gene pools change over time. Here is the outline for the Evolution Natural Selection movies covering both core and additional higher level. Use this outline to find the movie you need. This movie is focused here. Let's jump in with some considered thinking. We have a curve that displays the phenotypic variation for some characteristic in a population across the x-axis, with frequency of individuals on the y-axis. We can quickly see that the phenotypic extremes are rare, while the intermediate forms of the characteristic are higher in number. This should not be a difficult idea. Imagine if we graphed the height of humans as the characteristic. We would find a bell-shaped curve. Lastly, this diagram assumes that the characteristic is controlled by many genes. It's polygenic, as would be true, say, of human height, or human weight, or human intelligence. And it goes on to nicely display the possible combinations of alleles that would be found in the population. The less probable combinations of alleles are rare, and the mixed combinations of alleles are in higher frequency. Again, this graph nicely displays the phenotypic variation for a characteristic as a bell-shaped curve. We can see low numbers of individuals at the extremes of the phenotypic variation. Large numbers of individuals display the intermediate form of the characteristic. The different combinations of alleles in individuals in the population sum up to an overall bell-shaped distribution of the character in the population. So that brings me to ask a question. What happens when selection is occurring? Does the frequency and variation of a phenotypic characteristic shift if selection is putting pressure on certain phenotypes in the population? For example, imagine that butterfly wing length varies genetically in the population, as you can see here. In the population, there are just a few small wings and just a few long wings, but there are many individuals with intermediate wing lengths. Now imagine if selection favored the long-winged butterflies. However subtle that selection would be, how would this curve shift? So butterfly wing length varies genetically in the population, and the short-winged butterflies are selected against, as this downward arrow represents negative selection pressure. The long-winged butterflies reproduce in higher numbers, however slightly, and the curve shifts to the right. This curve represents time 1, and this curve represents time 2. A change in the allele frequency in the population over time results in a phenotypic shift, evolution. Here's another way to think of these two curves. The time difference, time 1, time 2, is substantial. Thus at time 1, this is species A, but at time 2, this is species B, different enough in its phenotype to be considered a different species. In this diagram of butterflies, it's suggested that these butterflies are selected against, while these butterflies are favored. Could you imagine the curve shifting to the right if the selection favored the darker winged butterflies? In this diagram, the x-axis has been altered slightly. Pay close attention. The variation in the phenotypic characteristic has been replaced by the species range, variation across space. In nature, we would find the phenotypic characteristic to vary across space from the southern edge of the range to the northern edge, with a higher frequency of individuals in between. Now imagine environmental change, such as a warming of the planet, where the southern edge of the species range is becoming increasingly warm. There would be pressure on the variance here to shift to the right, either by migrating or evolving. The changing environment would favor a certain end of the phenotypic spectrum, and the population would shift over evolutionary time or be forced to migrate. The question is, how fast is evolution happening? How fast is the environment changing? Can species evolve rapidly enough to overcome the rate at which the environment changes? So here is an IB syllabus statement of relevance. Discuss the ideas on the pace of evolution, including gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. I'll deal with punctuated equilibrium later in this movie. This diagram shows phenotypic variation or structural variation against frequency, but adds time, and it adds time in a very nice way. Follow along. The diagram shows phenotypic character labeled structure shifting to the right over time as the variants at one end of the phenotypic spectrum are favored by the environment, and this is known as directional selection. The diagram shows a gradual change in the phenotype over time. The pace of the evolution is relatively slow and progressive through many intermediate forms. This is known as gradualism. Remember, as this diagram nicely shows, there is always variation, even as selection pressure shifts the phenotype in a certain direction. As one last note, if enough time passes and enough change occurs, this population and this population may be different enough to be considered separate species. In other words, speciation has occurred over time. Here is a different graph displaying the results of two experiments where artificial selection occurred. A scientist selected mice with large body weights to mate, and over time, the average mass of the population went up. Directional selection. In the second experiment, the smallest mice were selected for mating, and the average mass of the population went down. Directional selection. Don't forget that each population at each moment in time continued to display variation due to meiosis. Selection cannot occur unless variation exists. In coming back to the frequency phenotype graphs that I've introduced earlier, we have time progressing from the bottom to the top. Notice that in the first 3 generations, there was no shift in the phenotype curve. Selection was not strong on this phenotypic characteristic, or selection was equal on both ends of the variation. Neither extreme was favored. This would be stabilizing selection. But in the 4th generation, directional selection occurred as the phenotype shifted to the right through the 4th, 5th, and 6th generations, with passable speciation. Then, in the last 2 generations, phenotype stabilized again with no directional selection. During the periods of stabilizing selection, no speciation is occurring. If you're wondering about aspects of the environment that would alter selection, imagine the effects of climate change. Now, this IB syllabus statement described one example of transient polymorphism. Should come as a surprise, because its use of language seems completely out of place with everything I've presented so far. But to the contrary, with this slide, I would like to review everything I've already presented, just with new language. In other words, I'm presenting nothing new in the slides to come other than applying new language to the same concepts. Before leaving this slide, let's define polymorphism. It is more than one allele for a gene. Alleles are the varieties or the alternative codes of a gene. Transient polymorphism is nothing more than directional selection, where one of the alleles is more advantageous than the other. So here is directional selection displaying gradual evolution, change in the population over time. This is known as transient polymorphism. Just apply the new language to the concept of directional selection and realize that industrial melanism or the story of the peppered moth would fit nicely here. Industrial melanism The Peppered Moth story is an example of directional selection. Industrial melanism, the Peppered Moth story, is an example of transient polymorphism. These graphs show the frequency of peppered moth forms in polluted and unpolluted habitats. You can see in the polluted habitat, the dark form was prevalent, whereas in the unpolluted habitat, the pale form was higher in frequency. In these graphs, we can see how the frequency of alleles shifts with a changing environment. We can see polymorphism in the peppered moth populations because there is more than one allele for a gene. We have a dark form, we have a pale form. And we can see transient polymorphism because in different environments, one of the alleles is more advantageous than the other. In a different example of transient polymorphism and industrial melanism, you can see that as the environment became less and less smoky, as indicated by these data points, with smoke on this y-axis, the frequency of the dark forms decreased. The dark forms of Adalia were selected against as the smoke cleared. Now let's go back and take a closer look at stabilizing selection, where neither extreme is favored over another, or in other words, selection pressure is equal on both extremes. Notice the effect. Look carefully. Variation is potentially reduced with no speciation possible. In regions with malaria, the sickle cell allele presents an interesting example of stabilizing selection. Individuals homozygous for normal hemoglobin are selected against by the malarial parasite, while individuals homozygous for sickle cell fare poorly due to the sickling of their blood cells, which reduces the efficient transport of oxygen in the blood. Thus, heterozygous individuals with both alleles, are favored in environments with malaria. Thus, both alleles for normal and sickle cell hemoglobin are maintained in the population. In other words, neither allele is favored, or you could say both extremes are equally selected against. This is stabilizing selection. This graph shows birth weight in humans, and you can see that birth weight is maintained within relatively narrow limits due to stabilizing selection. Mortality is high at low birth weights, this end of the phenotypic spectrum, and mortality is high at high birth weights, this end of the spectrum. Infants with large birth weights have high mortality due to the difficulties surrounding the birthing of large babies. And infants with small birth weights have high mortality because of the health risks associated with being too small at birth. In other words, the intermediate birth weight, neither extreme, is the one that's favored. This is stabilizing selection. So coming back to polymorphism, which is when there is more than one allele for a gene, also remembering that alleles are the varieties or the alternative codes of a gene, let's apply the language of polymorphism to stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, no allele is favored over another, so this is called balanced polymorphism. The situation is stable. If both alleles confer some survival advantage, then both alleles will persist in the population. The sickle cell story in malarial areas is a great example of balanced polymorphism. Here are the relevant IB syllabus statements. Describe one example of transient polymorphism. The Peppered Moth story would be a good one. And describe sickle cell anemia as an example of balanced polymorphism. With this slide, I'm returning to the story of sickle cell anemia in malarial areas. This is balanced polymorphism, balanced selection pressures. Let's take a look. We can see that individuals who are homozygous sickle cell are selected against, and individuals that are homozygous for normal hemoglobin are selected against in a malarial environment. The heterozygote is favored in the malarial environment. This is balanced polymorphism as both alleles are maintained in the malarial environment. Sickle cell anemia, as an example of stabilizing selection, only applies to an environment with the malarial parasite. If the parasite is removed, individuals homozygous for the sickle cell allele are selected against, while individuals homozygous for the normal hemoglobin allele are favored. This would result in a change in the frequency of alleles over time. This would be directional selection or transient polymorphism. There are other examples of balanced polymorphism, and you can see one example in this image where these snails live in a patchy habitat. In a patchy habitat, all of the various phenotypes of shell color are favored. Thus, no one coloration pattern is favored over another. This would be balanced polymorphism. Here is data that shows that banded yellow snails do better in hedgerows, while unbanded non-yellow snails do better in woods. The two habitats, in close proximity to one another, maintain different selection pressures that maintain phenotypic balance in shell phenotypes. This again is balanced polymorphism. This graph shows selection by birds on snails, various morphs of snails in a patchy habitat over time. We can see that the yellow snails are selected heavily early and that the banded snails are selected heavily late. The habitat might be patchy across space, as it was in the last example, but it might also be patchy over time, allowing different colors of snail to be favored at different times of year, thus maintaining both colors over longer periods of time. This is balanced polymorphism. And lastly, among the lines of selection pressures, there is a phenomenon known as disruptive selection, where both extremes are favored while the intermediate form is selected against. There are a handful of examples of disruptive selection, but you might imagine over time that the two populations with the extreme phenotypes could become different enough such that they would be considered new species. And that brings us to two IB syllabus statements. Discuss ideas on the pace of evolution, including gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. State that speciation due to divergence of isolated populations can be gradual or abrupt. I've shown you this image before of gradualism, where the population changes slowly through a series of intermediate forms over time, such that the population at this end of time might be considered different than this population, different enough to be called separate species. This is also an example of transient polymorphism. Now, what would this diagram look like if environmental change was rapid or the selection pressure was suddenly very strong? The phenotypic change might be dramatic, to the right, for example, before settling on a more gradual change over time. This diagram shows gradualism on the left and punctuated equilibrium on the right. Time lies along the y-axis and phenotypic variation along the x-axis. This is gradualism because there is slow change in phenotype through intermediate forms over time. The species at this point in time may not be the same species that existed at this point in time. But if environmental change is rapid and or the selection pressure is strong, then phenotypic change may happen over short bursts of time. As can be seen here, the species changes rapidly in these short time periods, and this is known as punctuation. Speciation can occur abruptly when the environment changes rapidly. This model on the right actually shows long periods of time of little change. This is known as equilibrium. But the equilibrium is punctuated by a burst of rapid evolution. In terms of the pace of evolution, the model on the right is called punctuated equilibrium. Once again, following the time axis here, we can see gradual change through intermediate forms over time. This is gradualism. But we also have periods of very little change punctuated by bursts of rapid change. Little change, equilibrium, punctuated by bursts of rapid change. Speciation can occur abruptly when the environment changes rapidly. In nature, the pace of evolution does vary. Sometimes there is little change over long periods of time, and sometimes the pace of change is rapid, with speciation occurring abruptly. Is it possible that species change very little, if at all, over long periods of time? Yes, it is, And the coelacanth is an interesting example. The coelacanth was known to people as an extinct species from fossils that had been found in 170 million year old rock. However, a live coelacanth was discovered in 1937 off the coast of Madagascar. The coelacanth, alive in today's oceans, look much like the fossils from 170 million year old rock. The fossil record nicely displays gradualism because with gradual change, slow change, there's a high probability of having a form fossilized, as can be seen in this series of fossils of horse foot evolution. This displays gradualism. The pace of evolution is known to vary. Evolution occurs gradually in some circumstances and rapidly in others. The problem is that fossil evidence for gradualism is strong, while the fossil evidence for rapid bursts of evolution, in other words punctuated equilibrium, is not strong because the probability of fossilization is less. Finding fossils that have meaning requires that all of these events occur. Thus, fossils with meaning are rare. In other words, fossilization is an improbable occurrence. If evolution is occurring rapidly, the chance of having intermediate forms fossilized is low. As can be seen here, with rapid bursts of change, one would expect the fossils of transition species to be scarce. Transition species are not long-lived, thus fossilization is more improbable. Remember that fossil records are always more incomplete than scientists would like because of the improbability of fossilization. Requires death covered quickly by sediments, buried to depth, pressed and heated, then uplifted and exposed, discovered and studied by knowledgeable people, and only certain parts of the body are preserved while others are lost. In the punctuated equilibrium model, one would expect fossils to be scarce, as the transition species are not long-lived, in combination with the improbability of fossilization. In terms of discussing the pace of evolution, the fossil record shows long periods of stability. Natural selection selects for adaptations resulting in many intermediate forms, and the transition forms are there. We have good examples such as the horse hoof evolution. And adaptive radiation is another example of gradualism. For punctuated equilibrium, the fossil record also shows sudden major change, rapid environmental change, strong directional selection. The rise of mammals 65 million years ago is probably an example of punctuated equilibrium. There is a lack of transition species that also supports punctuated equilibrium. There is rapid evolution, which is not easy to catch given the improbability of fossilization. As well, consider that polyploidy might contribute to rapid evolutionary change. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Evolution Natural Selection Additional Higher Level Part 2, Topic 10.3.